In April 1945, with Berlin burning all around him, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his underground bunker for the German dictator. It was the end of a catastrophic chain of events that had seen his mighty war machine grind to a halt. Outside, the Red Army stormed through the city, while inside, Hitler's inner circle desperately awaited their imminent capture by the advancing Soviets. Amongst them was Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, who received word from Hitler's successor, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, to scuttle the fleet and escape with as many U-boats as possible. The mission was dubbed Operation Deadlight and would see the largest fleet of submarines in history vanish into the depths of the Atlantic. But while most of the U-boats did indeed sink, weeks later, strange things began to happen. Dozens of missing subs began reappearing off the remote coasts of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. How did they get there? And who was really on board? You're watching this channel. Join me today as we uncover the astonishing story of Nazi Germany SC, U-boat operations in the Atlantic, and the hidden alliances that allowed war criminals to flee justice. When Grand Admiral Erich Raeder gave the order for Operation Deadlight, he knew that there was little hope of survival for the German Navy. Since the start of the war, the Atlantic Fleet had taken heavy losses due to the growing strength of the US Navy. By April 1945, only around 30 U-boats were still operational. Rather than allow these advanced German vessels to fall into enemy hands, Raeder ordered them to be scuttled in a desperate attempt to deny the US valuable intelligence and technology. Most of the submarines were in port at the time and were easily destroyed using powerful explosives. However, 26 U-boats were out in the open ocean when the order was given. With no way to communicate the new orders, Dönitz had no choice but to flee with these submarines and hide them somewhere safe. The chosen location was a remote stretch of coastline along Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, known as the Brazilian coast. It was almost 6,000 miles away from the nearest Allied vessel, making it almost impossible to detect. What followed was one of the largest covert operations in history. Dönitz and his crew raced against time to reach the coast. Before Allied forces could close in, the journey was fraught with danger. However, and many U-boats were lost along the way. Of the 26 submarines that set sail for South America, only 18 ever arrived. As they approached the coast, the U-boats hid in a series of secluded bays and coves. Some were damaged and needed repairs, while others remained submerged for months to avoid detection. Amazingly, they managed to evade Allied forces for over 2 years, even as peace talks between Germany and the Allies were underway. However, eventually the game was up. As tensions eased and Allied forces began withdrawing, the German subs knew that their time was running out. They had to emerge and somehow explain their presence off the South American coast. In an incredible stroke of luck, they met with a friendly face. Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay had all maintained strict neutrality throughout the war. When the German submarines emerged, therefore, they were greeted by local officials who saw the sailors not as war criminals, but as guests. Nazi leaders had been secretly negotiating with the South American nations. 1943. The Germans offered the South Americans advanced German technology and hinted at lucrative post-war business opportunities. The South Americans, in turn, agreed to look after any fleeing Nazis and even offered to help them escape to neutral nations like Spain or Portugal, while the local people were largely sympathetic to the plight of the Germans. The same could not be said of the Jewish communities. Many South Americans of Jewish descent called for the U-boat sailors to be arrested and sent to Nuremberg, but once again, the local governments ignored these pleas. Over the next few years, the German sailors lived amongst the local population, some working in factories and others setting up businesses. Eventually, most of them left South America and returned to Germany, but not before they had helped bring an end to the Third Reich. The year is 1943. For 2 years, Nazi German U-boats have been waging an undersea war against the shipping and supply lines of the United Kingdom, the British Empire and their allies. The goal has been nothing less than total disruption of supplies reaching Great Britain, which would break British morale and allow for a successful invasion of the island nation by land forces. Although the threat of invasion never materialized, U-boat warfare did take a heavy toll, and by 1943, more than 2,000 merchant ships had been sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic, and the U-boat campaign had just begun. This incredible loss of life and shipping continued into 1944. By May of that year, more than 2,700 merchant ships had been sunk, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. What happens next might surprise you. Welcome to my channel. Today, we're going to see how a submarine campaign in World War II led to the discovery of a hidden paradise. We'll explore why so many Nazis fled to South America and what role the war played in the settlement of Patagonia. It is a story that takes us from the depths of the frigid Atlantic to the breathtaking peaks of the Andes. And it all starts with a terrifying weapon. As the war in Europe raged, few weapons were more deadly or more feared than the Nazi German U-boat. A highly trained crew of 50 men would operate these sleek black submarines for weeks at a time, submerged beneath the surface of the ocean. They carried powerful torpedoes that could sink large merchant ships before resurfacing to fire their onboard guns at anything that got too close. Their most common target was the supply ships bringing food, fuel, and munitions to Great Britain. If they could starve the British people into submission, then the entire British Empire would collapse without a fight. But the true horror of the U-boat came from the fact that they operated with deadly precision. Oftentimes, they would come up just beneath the waves to sneak up on their prey, firing torpedoes from mere feet beneath the ship's hull. Crews of merchant ships had no warning until it was too late. In some cases, survivors reported seeing nothing but the conning tower of the U-boat as it sped away after delivering its payload. By early 1943, it became clear that the Allies would not be deterred. Convoys of merchant ships traveled in tight formations, escorted by warships of the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, and other Allied nations. This made it much harder for the U-boats to deliver fatal blows. In response, the Germans created wolf packs, groups of U-boats that would hunt down and kill any convoy that ventured out into the Atlantic. Working together, they could effectively blockade large areas of the sea, forcing supply ships to slow down and become easier targets. Some of the U-boats even made it as far west as the east coast of the United States, attacking ships carrying supplies for the troops in Europe. But now the tables were slowly beginning to turn. As the war progressed, the Allies developed better technology to detect and destroy the sonar systems became widespread, and the Germans lost their advantage of being undetected. Radar also helped direct aircraft to U-boats on the surface, and once attacked, the crews of merchant ships fought back against the U-boat menace. Escort ships patrolled closely around the convoys and were often able to fend off the attacks of individual U-boats. By 1944, the U-boat campaign was effectively over, Nazi Germany had lost more than 25% of its submarine force. With each passing month, the pressure was on to find a way to keep the war going. There would be no victory in the Atlantic, so command began devising a plan to survive. We know today what happened next. You may have heard of it. You might even have visited this place yourself. But back in 1944, it was one of the most remote settlements in the world. The Germans first began settling the area in 1848, when a group of 300 immigrants arrived in what is today known as Puerto Natales. They came seeking a new life in a land full of promise. At the time, this part of South America was little more than a wild frontier. There were some small settlements, but vast areas of Patagonia remained unexplored and untouched. The immigrants established farms and began raising livestock, taking advantage of the region's seemingly endless open spaces. Over the next few decades, more Germans would follow, drawn by the same dreams of a better life. By 1933, there were already more than 6,000 Germans living in Chile, but their dream of a new life was about to become a nightmare. When Adolf Hitler took power, his expansionist policies soon threatened to engulf Europe in war. As the conflict spread across the continent, the Germans living in Chile watched nervously. They had built a life far from the turmoil of Europe, and they hoped it would stay that way. But as the war intensified, it became clear that peace was not an option. When Germany declared war on the United States in 1942, things changed dramatically. The Chilean government, which had previously maintained a policy of neutrality, now found itself forced to choose a side. The Germans in Chile were caught in the middle. Many of them were dual nationals, holding both German and Chilean citizenship. They had hoped that their loyalty to Chile would protect them, but they soon found themselves facing discrimination and persecution. As the war dragged on and the fate of Germany became increasingly uncertain, the Germans in Chile began to fear for their future. They knew that if Germany lost the war, they would likely face reprisals from the victorious Allies. In an effort to escape this fate, many of them began planning to flee to Argentina. In January 1945, news reached Patagonia that shook the German community to its core. Hitler had taken his own life, and Germany had surrendered. Now they were on the losing side of a global conflict. Panic set in. Hundreds began packing their belongings and preparing to leave as quickly as possible. Fearing the worst, they fled inland, hoping the mountains would protect them. Soon, trucks, cars, and even horses were thundering over mountain passes leading away from the coast, carrying families and their hopes for a better future to Argentina. Others who couldn't afford transportation abandoned their homes and set out on foot, trekking across some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world. What happens next is a remarkable tale of survival and resilience. These German settlers, driven by desperation and fear, turned to the rugged wilderness of Patagonia and the Andes Mountains for sanctuary. Facing freezing temperatures, treacherous landscapes, and the constant threat of starvation, they pushed on, determined to reach the safety of Argentina. This journey was not just a physical one. It was a test of the human spirit. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing meager rations as they trekked over the Andes. The determination to reach Argentina kept them going. Many of them had left behind everything they knew, hoping for a chance at a new life. Upon reaching Argentina, they faced another challenge: convincing the Argentine government to grant them asylum. After much negotiation, the Argentine government agreed to accept the German refugees, but it wasn't without conditions. Many of them had to work in labor camps, building roads and other infrastructure projects. It was hard, back-breaking work, but it was a price they were willing to pay for their freedom. Years passed, and slowly the refugees began to rebuild their lives. They started small businesses, farms, and even schools for their children. They brought with them German skills and traditions that had a lasting impact on Argentine culture. Despite the hardships they had endured, these German immigrants had carved out a new life for themselves in Argentina. And it's here where our story of the German escape from South America comes full circle. Because as we know, their flight to Argentina didn't end in the fertile lands of Patagonia. Many of them pressed on further, following an ancient trail used by indigenous peoples centuries before. They headed into the heart of the Andes Mountains, a place almost untouched by civilization, to establish a secret colony in the shadow of the Andes. Hidden away from the rest of the world, they built a life of isolation and secrecy. Here, deep in the mountains, they were safe from the prying eyes of the outside world. It was a place where they could start anew, free from the memories of the war and the persecution that had driven them from their homeland. It was a long, arduous journey. They traveled for weeks, enduring harsh weather conditions and difficult terrain, but finally, they reached a valley that would become their home. It was a place of great natural beauty, surrounded by snow-capped peaks and lush green valleys. Here, away from the noise and chaos of the outside world, they could finally begin to heal. They built homes and farms, creating a self-sufficient community. They grew crops, raised livestock, and hunted wild game. They lived a simple, hard life, but it was a life of freedom. It was a place where they could raise their children in peace, free from the fear of war or persecution. For the German refugees, it was a true hidden paradise, a place where they could escape the troubles of the outside world and build a new life for themselves and their children. It was a place they called home. The year is 1945, and Adolf Hitler is a dead man. Berlin is surrounded by Allied forces, and his days are numbered. But somewhere far from the carnage of the Third Reich, he's sipping mate and taking in the sights of Buenos Aires. Yup, we're talking about Argentina, the country that played it pretty safe during World War II by maintaining a strict policy of neutrality. Argentina wasn't exactly neutral, though its government, particularly under the staunchly nationalist President Juan, had deep sympathies with the Axis powers, and even allowed German U-boats to refuel and resupply at certain ports. Now, whether they were turning a blind eye to these activities or actively encouraging them, intelligence reports surfaced in 1944, suggesting that high-ranking German officers were holding secret meetings with South American officials even before the war ended. So as the Allies tightened their grip around Germany, Argentina offered those same Nazis sanctuary in Argentina, seemingly in exchange for some serious favors and technological secrets. But how could a gaggle of aging Nazis flee the city without so much as a whisper of dissent? How does one sneak an entire government out of a besieged city? Well, it was actually a lot simpler than you might think. It only took a few submarines. So, how did Argentina go from reluctant ally to safe haven for Nazis? To understand how this band of desperados managed to navigate the seas, we have to understand the state of play in 1945. You see, when hostilities began in Europe, Argentina declared itself neutral, but not everyone was happy with that decision. Many Portucos, the local name for people who live in Buenos Aires, had deep ties to Germany through family and culture, and Perón was sympathetic to the plight of his citizens of German descent. The economy didn't help either. As trade with Europe became more difficult, the already unstable economy soured. So when peace talks fell through and it seemed like the war would drag on, decided that Argentina needed a plan B. On June 1944, 2 years before the war in Europe ended, met with the German ambassador, along with the Italians and Japanese ambassadors to discuss just such a plan. According to reports, believed that if the Axis won the war, Argentina would gain significant territory in the South Pacific, namely Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil. The deal with the devil was struck. From then on, Argentina's ports were ordered to allow German U-boats to dock and resupply. This was done under the guise of refueling. But most historians agree that the Germans were also able to offload sensitive cargo and possibly even passengers. Although there are conflicting reports about the numbers, some say that as many as 2,000 Nazis made it to South America via Argentina, while others argue that the total was closer to 200. What we can say with certainty is that several high-ranking members of the Nazi Party made it to Argentina, including Admiral Karl Donitz, Joseph Mengele, and Arthur Rudolph, all of whom had direct lines of communication with Perón. But why would Perón do this? The answer, as it often does, lies in the realm of economics. You see, Argentina had defaulted on its debt 3 times since the beginning of the century and was desperately in need of foreign investment. Hoped that by granting these men asylum, he'd be able to broker deals with West Germany after the war. There was also a more sinister reason behind Argentina's actions. Was an ardent anti-Semite who blamed international bankers for the instability of his nation's economy. In fact, he deported over 2,000 Jews to Europe during the war. So it's no surprise that he'd want to court the favor of the Nazi leadership, especially since some of those bankers had made their way to Argentina as well. Now, you may have noticed that this whole arrangement doesn't sound too different from what happened in neighboring Brazil. And you'd be right. For a time, the two countries worked in tandem to funnel Nazis to safety in South America. But the Brazilians weren't nearly as discreet about it. They wanted the world to know that they were welcoming these scientists, which made them popular with the US government. Argentina, however, was a little more cagey. By May 1945, news was spreading across Latin America that Hitler had taken his own life. The rest of the world hadn't caught up yet, but it was only a matter of time. With Allied troops bearing down on Germany, Perón knew that soon it would be over. So he sent a telegram to the Foreign Ministry outlining the terms of the agreement with the Axis powers. Should Germany fall to the Allies, Argentina would grant Hitler and other prominent Nazis asylum. In return, Perón wanted advanced German technology, particularly in the realm of nuclear research. Other reports suggest that Perón also wanted Hitler to install a pro-Argentinian government in post-war Germany, something that would likely never happen. As the fighting drew to a close, the German leadership realized that it was game over, so they began Operation Ratlins, which aimed to smuggle Nazi personnel out of Germany and into South America. There were multiple routes, but the main ones started in Italy and Austria. With the help of corrupt officials and sympathetic clergy, Nazis would make their way to these countries' borders, where they'd be given new identities and false documentation. From there, they'd board waiting trains, or sometimes planes bound for Argentina. And to make things easier, the Germans used a special code phrase, Victoria, Alberta, Hanover, to identify fellow Nazis. If someone responded to the greeting with the word Landschaft, then they knew that they were dealing with a trusted party member. But once in South America, how did they get from the relatively civilized world of Buenos Aires to the relative wilds of the Argentinian interior? That's where the River Plate came in. Now, if you've ever seen images of the river, you've probably thought, wait a second, That looks like a bunch of swamps. You're not wrong. In fact, the river is considered one of the world's most polluted rivers because of industrial and agricultural runoff. But for the Nazis, it was an ideal place to set up shop. In fact, the first group of Nazis settled in the small town of Villa, which sits along the banks of the others headed further north to the farming communities around the Delta region, which was home to some of Argentina's most fertile lands. These refugees built homes and businesses and even brought over their servants from Germany. Many of them lived comfortable lives, all while evading the long arm of the law. Some of them even held influential jobs in the government, but they were never truly safe. Every knock on the door sounded like an FBI agent. Every face in the crowd could be an undercover Israeli agent, and that paranoia drove some of them to keep moving. Mengele, for example, moved from his home in São Paulo to the resort town of where he lived for years under the assumed name of Pedro Blaine. He worked as a doctor until a broken heart forced him to stop, and he spent his last years running a small hotel. Ultimately, though, they all got caught up in the end. Mengele drowned in 1979 while trying to smuggle chemicals from Brazil into Argentina, and many of the others faced trials in Israel, Austria, and Germany. But what about the man who engineered the whole affair? Died in 1974, never having seen justice for his crimes against humanity. But he wasn't the only person to profit from the deal. Argentina received the advanced German technology that it craved, and some believe that it used that knowledge to develop its own nuclear weapons program. Unfortunately, we may never know the full story behind Argentina's cozy relationship with the Nazis, but that hasn't stopped Hollywood from giving it the old college try, and now you know why those sons of guns never got caught. On July 1945, an Argentinian fishing boat spotted a strange vessel surfacing off the coast of Mar del Plata. It was a U-boat. Its bow was painted green, its stern yellow, and it seemed almost otherworldly to the fishermen who had never seen a submarine before. The submarine dropped a white flag from its conning tower and signaled its surrender. It identified itself as U-530. Its captain, Herr Fritz, hoped that by surrendering to Argentina, he would avoid prosecution at the hands of the British and French, both of whom were eager to get their hands on German U-boat technology. Unfortunately for him, his gamble didn't pay off. The Argentines turned over the men and the sub to the British. When the ship arrived at a British naval base in the Caribbean, people noticed that something was very wrong. First of all, there were no obvious signs of a battle. The vessel had no damage. There was no oil or fuel on the water, which meant that it hadn't been. Why would a German submarine operating late in the war have surrendered without being attacked? Second, the crew appeared well-fed and healthy, dressed in fine uniforms and seemingly unfazed by their situation. Finally, the crew told the British that they could unprovide any information about the sub-S activities because their logs were missing. None of this made sense, and to this day, no one knows what really happened to U-530. But U-530 wasn't alone. 2 months later, another German submarine, U-977, showed up in Argentina under equally strange circumstances. This time, however, the Germans weren't so lucky. The British captured the submarine and executed Captain Wilhelm Hart. In an effort to uncover the truth, the British began searching for answers. They found clues in the ship's log, It detailed U-977's departure from France on May 16, 1945. After that, nothing until July 2nd when it docked in Mar del Plata. The log said nothing about the mission between those dates, nor did it mention the submarine's subsequent flight to Japan. The British knew that Germany and Japan were still at war with each other, but the thought of a German submarine traveling across the Atlantic Ocean to rendezvous with Japanese forces was beyond bizarre. The answer, it turned out, lay in a small community of Nazis living in Argentina. The first confirmed case of a German fleeing to Argentina came in 1942, when a man named Gustav became the honorary consul general of Germany in Brazil. Though his true purpose was to assist German spies and agents entering Brazil, he remained officially as a representative of the German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi organization based in New York. Once Germany lost the war, he and other Nazi leaders fled to Argentina. To this day, there is speculation that Adolf Hitler himself may have escaped to South America, though there is no evidence to support this. Some conspiracy theorists even claim that he faked his death in 1945. However, there is no evidence to support this theory either. What is clear, though, is that Nazi sympathizers were helping Nazis flee to Argentina throughout the end of the war and afterward. These people wanted a fascist government in Argentina and believed that if the war was lost, the best way to ensure that fascism triumphed was to bring as many Nazis into the country as possible. The vast majority of these Nazis were military personnel, especially from the Schutzstaffel. Though thousands of German troops fled to Argentina, most of them were caught. The Germans were extremely suspicious of the locals, who were quick to turn anyone over to the authorities. Only 348 Germans entered the country illegally. However, this was more than enough to establish a network of collaborators. Though some of these spies worked for the Abwehr, the German military intelligence agency, most were members of the SDA, clandestine organization that carried out Adolf Hitler's dirty work. With the help of local fascists, the SD spies monitored shipping lanes, looking for Allied vessels that they could attack, and they continued to send coded messages to Germany long after the war ended. But that's not why they were in Argentina. While some of the spies were undoubtedly working for the Nazi government, others came on behalf of German industrialists like IG Farben and the Flick Corporation. These men were interested in setting up businesses in Argentina that would benefit from close ties to the government. At the time, the German war machine was profiting from forced labor. IG Farben operated factories near concentration camps, where prisoners were paid next to nothing or nothing at all for their work. They exploited the prisoners, but the war put a stop to that. So now IG Farben wanted to set up shop in Argentina, a country whose government was still run by fascists. However, that wasn't the only thing these men were hiding. Many were also members of the SS and had war crimes to hide. Using false identities, they lived out the remainder of their lives in Argentina, safe from the reach of the Allies. One such man was Joseph. During World War II, he performed terrible human experiments at Auschwitz, including injecting pregnant women with diseases and testing chemicals on twins. When the Soviets took control of Auschwitz, he knew he was in danger. With the help of an underground resistance group, he escaped east and made his way to Argentina, where he lived out the rest of his life. Another Nazi who fled to Argentina was Franz Stangl, who oversaw the killings at Treblinka. He was known as the Architect of Hell and helped oversee the killings of more than 3 million Jews. After the war ended, he worked at a cigarette factory and then as a farmer. He was eventually caught and spent 7 years in prison before being released on the grounds of ill health. He died in 1978. SS General and war criminal Arthur Rudolph was also granted asylum in Argentina. His crimes included overseeing the construction of the infamous rail line at Auschwitz that transported people to the gas chambers. He lived in Argentina under the name Adolf Bergs, eventually becoming a naturalized citizen. He was eventually extradited to Germany, where he spent 4 years in prison, before dying in 1982. Not every war criminal made it to Argentina, though. Karl Diller, who ran one of Germany's biggest weapons factories, was captured and tried for war crimes. However, he was able to convince the courts that he was a low-ranking clerk at the company and was sentenced to only 3 years in prison. Upon release, he fled to Argentina and lived there as a businessman until 1979, when he was extradited back to Germany to face charges. He died in prison in 1980, but the Nazis weren't just bringing war criminals and spies to Argentina. There was another group that was eager to flee Germany. That group was Jewish. As early as 1933, Jewish scientists, business people, and academics began leaving Germany. These were the people who knew that things were going badly in Germany. They saw firsthand how the Nazi Party was stripping Jews of their rights and feared for their safety. By 1941, more than 100,000 Jews had left Germany. Of that number, an estimated 2,000 ended up in Argentina. Most of these refugees had money and connections that allowed them to bribe immigration officials. However, once they arrived, they faced discrimination and anti-Semitic violence from the local population. Still, they were better off than the Jews who were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. As the end of the war approached, rumors spread that the Germans were rounding up all the Jews in Europe and deporting them to the east. People who heard these rumors assumed that the Germans were planning to kill every Jew in Europe. Those who believed this wanted to escape Germany. For them, Argentina was an ideal destination. Between 1933 and 1945, the country took in more than 90,000 European immigrants, many of whom were Jewish. Argentina's government saw these immigrants as an opportunity to boost the economy and gain political clout. However, when the war ended, the policy changed. Argentina closed its borders to German immigrants, fearing that they might be war criminals or spies. So while it's true that German submarines were spotted off the coast of Argentina in 1945, and while it's true that Nazis and Jewish refugees were pouring into the country, there is no evidence that these two groups met up or that the submarines were bringing Nazis into the country. Instead, it seems likely that the submarines either brought supplies to German spies already in the country, or were used to transport captured German soldiers. Even in the unlikely event that some Nazis did make it ashore, it's difficult to see how a handful of men could have made much of an impact. Most of them were educated, highly skilled individuals who could easily find work in Argentina's burgeoning industries. A few war criminals slipped through the cracks and were able to live out the rest of their lives in Argentina, but there is no evidence that they ever formed a secret society, or that German U-boats were bringing people into the country. In the end, it seems that this mystery is best described as a case of Nazi sightings, not Nazi infiltration. Berlin was falling, but the city's defenders had bigger problems than Hitler's ranting megalomania. Soviet troops poured through the weakened German defenses. Flyers plastered the streets, urging civilians to flee west. Before it was too late, the end of the Third Reich was nigh. But amidst all this chaos, several top Nazis slipped away from the crumbling capital and disappeared. They vanished without a trace, leaving behind rumors that circulated for decades, tales of secret submarines filled with Nazi gold or even biological weapons. Some people even said Adolf Hitler himself got away. escaping by U-boat to South America with a small group of loyalists. Historians continue to debate this controversial theory today. But whether or not he made it off the continent, one thing is certain. Many of Germany's former elite would be living out their days far from the ruins they once called home. Men like Adolf Eichmann, the logistical mastermind behind the Holocaust, who would be later tried and executed for his crimes against humanity. Or Joseph Mengele, the infamous doctor who performed cruel experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz, who lived to be over 70 before dying in 1979 while on holiday in Brazil. So how did these monsters manage to escape justice? How did they evade Allied forces and lay low until their twilight years? And can we really believe that the man responsible for starting the deadliest war in human history managed to slip between the net? Join us as we look into the bizarre ways Nazis escaped Berlin and the shocking places where they went to hide. As the Red Army closed in, more and more desperate souls sought refuge in Hitler's underground bunker complex. It was a labyrinth of tunnels and rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery, where the Nazi leadership formulated their plans and held meetings deep below the city. On April 29, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler took his own life, Admiral Karl Donitz, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, moved into the Vorbunker with his wife and 4 children. He stayed there for 3 days until May, when he left the site and made his way to Flensburg in northern Germany. This was the last stop of the Third Reich, the temporary capital of the defeated nation. It was here that Donitz received orders from Hitler, and it was here that he signed the instrument of surrender for the German Navy. When the war was over, Donitz was arrested by the British and taken to London to stand trial for war crimes. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but only served 4. Interestingly, given his role in the Third Reich, Donitz has become something of an urban legend among conspiracy theorists. There are those who claim he actually shot Hitler, ending the Nazi leader's life prematurely, so that he could take over the fleeing government. However, this is most likely nothing more than an attempt to explain Donitz's surprisingly light sentence. After his release from prison, he returned to Germany, wrote his memoirs, and died in 1983. South America, a secret stash of Nazi treasure. That was stolen loot, hidden away by the party faithful during the closing days of World War II. Stories about a shipment of gold bars disappearing into the ether have persisted since the conflict ended. The biggest story comes from the testimony of Joseph, appeared before a congressional committee in 1946. He told the investigators that Germans planned to ship gold bars and other valuables to Argentina in advance of the impending invasion. However, the operation was cancelled after news broke that American troops had crossed the Rhine River. The following year, Perr appeared swore an affidavit claiming that he'd seen several planes land at an airfield near Buenos Aires in 1945. Each plane carried between 6 and 8 men, plus trunks filled with documents, money, jewelry, and works of art. It's believed that these items were the proceeds of the Nazi regime's slave labor program. Many of the items were never recovered, but this isn't the only time that Nazi gold has been rumored to have reached South America. Other stories tell of gold being smuggled into Brazil aboard U-boats filled with looted treasure. Another rumor claims that an entire Nazi research facility was transported to South America to continue its work under the guise of a scientific exchange program. Whether or not any of this is true remains a mystery, but it does help explain why prominent Nazis like Joseph Mengele and Adolf Eichmann were later found living comfortable lives in South America. Both men are believed to have fled to Argentina first, before eventually making their way to other nations in the region. U-boat, the ocean depths hold many secrets, but perhaps none more enduring than the lost U-boats of World War II. These deadly German submarines prowled the Atlantic and the seas around Europe, hunting down Allied vessels, but by 1945, they were on the losing side. With Germany beaten and its cities in ruins, many U-boat crews were ordered to scuttle their ships rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. What better way to disappear than to take your enemy's navies straight to hell? Some legends say they might have even taken Hitler with them. One of the more popular theories among conspiracy theorists is that the German dictator evaded capture and fled Argentina via U-boat with Eva Braun and a small group of loyalists. They supposedly arrived in Argentina, where they spent the rest of their lives running a ranch near the town of Coronel Pringle. But there is absolutely no evidence to support this theory. All accounts agree that Hitler killed himself in his bunker alongside his lover and his deputy, Rudolf Hess. Even the Soviets, who had every reason to lie about the circumstances of his death, claimed that Hitler took his own life. Those who insist that he escaped point to his oddly vague will, which didn't mention Eva Braun or make any arrangements for the future of the Nazi Party. But this can easily be explained by the fact that Braun and Hitler weren't married. Under German law at the time, he couldn't leave anything to her in his will. As for the party, it was effectively finished. There was no need for him to worry about what happened next. In fact, the only person he left anything to was his personal valet, who was left with Hitler's toothbrush and other personal items. Perhaps the most popular figure to escape the collapsing Nazi regime was none other than he was one of the architects of the Holocaust and one of the highest-ranking members of the Nazi Party. But when German morale collapsed, he grew afraid of retribution from the incoming Allies. While the whereabouts of many prominent Nazis was known, Himmler disappeared from the public eye after the war began to turn against the Germans. The last confirmed sighting of him took place in April 1945. He was captured by British troops just weeks later and sentenced to death by a military tribunal. His crime: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace and war crimes. Just as he was about to be hanged, he bit into a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and died instantly. Some people still wonder if this was a clever ruse to escape justice. Could he have swapped places with one of his guards? Did he simply spit out the cyanide when the coast was clear? Well, sadly, we may never know for sure. SS troops, among the most terrifying of Hitler's armies, were the infamous SS troops. They were brutal soldiers and fanatical enforcers of Nazi ideology. But with the Third Reich crumbling around them, some of these black-clad warriors had to make a decision. Should they fight to the death, surrender and risk being tried for war crimes, or escape to parts unknown? Some, like Joseph Dietrich, took the first option, fighting to the bitter end. Others surrendered, hoping their past deeds wouldn't be held against them. But many chose to run, melting away into the crowds as the Allies took over. Over the following years, a number of former SS men were spotted working in civilian jobs across Europe. They'd adopted new identities and hoped that nobody would recognize them. But some of the luckless Wokwar were eventually identified and arrested. Men like Alois Sprung, who was tried and convicted for deporting thousands of French citizens to concentration camps, only to escape prison 13 years later and live out the rest of his life in Syria. Or Gerhard Kretschmer, who oversaw the killings of hundreds of people in Poland and then lived for decades in Chile under a false name before being caught and returned to Germany to face justice. For more than 2 decades, the fate of one of history's most evil organizations remained a mystery. Then in 1964, the Simon Wiesenthal Center was formed with the goal of tracking down Nazi war criminals and bringing them to justice. The center has been successful in its mission, helping authorities around the world identify and arrest numerous former members of the SS. But despite the best efforts of the organization, some Nazis remain at large. There are an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Nazi war criminals still living in hiding today. What do you think? Did any of these Nazis deserve to escape justice? The year is 1945, and World War II has just come to an end. Adolf Hitler's regime has been brought down, and much of Nazi Germany lies in ruins. The world celebrates justice has been done, or so it seems. In the following decades, many people will claim they saw Adolf Hitler in South America. Claims that he escaped to Argentina and lived out his days in a peaceful retirement, far away from the atrocities he committed in his home country. A man who looked just like him was spotted in Brazil too. And now here's the kicker. Official documents from the CIA, MI6 and the Argentine archives have been declassified over the last 30 years. Many confirm intelligence on Nazi escape routes, code names and ratlins. There are maps, eyewitness accounts, even financial transfers. So did Hitler escape, or are these all coincidences? We have confirmation that top Nazis made their way to South America, but no proof that Hitler himself got there. In fact, the only evidence that he left Europe at all is an unconfirmed report from Soviet intelligence. And then there's a couple of grainy black and white photos. For those who think this story is a bunch of hogwash, there's no need to look further. They argue that after 6 years of war, everyone was tired and just wanted it to be over. People were ready to believe that Hitler had died in the bunker, that justice had been served, so anyone who came forward claiming to have seen him in the aftermath must have been mistaken. But what if we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg above the surface? What if there are more confirmed reports hiding in plain sight in the declassified files? We know for a fact that Hitler wasn't in Berlin when the Soviet troops rolled in. An eyewitness account from CIA officer Alan Welsh Dulles tells us this. He was at the very end of the Russian victory parade, riding in a staff car with other American officials. The Russians were parading their prisoners before them, including people from the German Foreign Office and SS officers. One of the captives was recognized by an African-American soldier riding in the back of the car. "Hey, get that guy out of here!" the soldier yelled. He was one of the guys handing out the papers when I was in Dachau prison camp. The prisoner was taken aside for questioning and returned to the group. "That was the only time I ever saw anyone break down and cry," said Dulles. He couldn't speak English, but he kept saying, "I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything." And he kept begging us to believe him. He insisted he was a doctor. All right, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but he wasn't Himmler or Goering or Goebbels. And as we later discovered, he wasn't even a Nazi party member. Hitler would have been in terrible danger had he been paraded through the streets of Berlin. At least for high-ranking Nazis met their demise at the hands of vengeful citizens in the final days of the war. Albert Speer, Joseph Goebbels' deputy, recalled seeing the corpses of 2 men hanging from a lamppost near the Reich. 2 SS generals, Arthur Rudolph and Hans Frank, met a similar fate. Though their bodies were burned, the Soviets wanted to put Rudolph on trial for his role in overseeing the deportation of Jews from France to concentration camps. But he was killed by French civilians before that could happen. Frank was the Governor-General of occupied Poland. He signed orders for the execution of nearly 3 million people. His body was found by Red Army soldiers near Nuremberg. It was mutilated and riddled with bullets. A lot of people who helped the Nazi regime met their end violently, but not all of them were big shots. Even Hitler's personal valet was killed. Victor stood, accused of stealing and selling items that belonged to Jewish victims of the Holocaust, according to an affidavit given by a witness named Israel. Once, Hitler entered his valet's room and found him emptying suitcases filled with stolen jewelry. Hitler confiscated the loot, which included women's shoes and fur coats. Later, Israeli heard gunshots coming from Hitler's apartment. He saw the dead body of Victor slumped against the door. He was lying in a pool of blood with a bullet hole in his forehead. The second bullet had missed him. It was sticking out of the wall behind him. Now, if Victor was shot dead for stealing from Jewish victims, what might have happened to Hitler if he'd been captured? Would he have gotten a fair trial, or would the public have wanted revenge? This is probably why Hitler decided to take his own life before the end of the war. He knew what awaited him if the Allies had caught him. But let's assume for a moment that he wasn't in Berlin. Let's assume that he escaped. How would he have pulled it off? Well, we know that Rattling U-boats were sailing from Germany to Argentina. These submarines were filled with Nazi officials, looted goods, and Hitler's money. They carried almost 900 passengers on 14 different trips between 1945 and 1949. Then there are the official documents from the CIA and MI6. Their classified reports indicate that the U-boat escape route was well known, and that some British agents were involved in helping Nazis escape. Here's how it worked. Submarines would leave Germany carrying hundreds of people and tons of loot. They would stop in secret coves in Norway, pick up more passengers, and then sail to Argentina. There was no formal organization to this operation. Rather, it was a combination of independent efforts from surviving members of the Nazi Party and people who simply didn't want the Soviets to win. British naval officer Herbert Richter wrote to the Director of Naval Intelligence regarding what he observed while stationed in Norway. It was perfectly obvious that the presence of a number of ex-enemy vessels and craft and the movement of persons connected therewith was being overlooked by our Norwegian and British friends, both military and civilian. One of the people who oversaw the escape operation was British agent Juan Pujol Garcia. He was also known as the Merchant of Souls. Pujol worked for British intelligence and helped orchestrate the escape of over 2,000 Nazis. Among them were Joseph Meng, Heribert Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and Alois Brunn. These people were wanted for crimes against humanity, but they slipped through Pujol's fingers and ended up in South America. British intelligence wanted to capture German scientists and military personnel after the war. They thought the US would want to put them on trial. But while the Americans were willing to accept former Nazis with technical knowledge, they drew the line at war criminals. So Britain kept a list of the people they wanted to send to the United States. When a U-boat arrived in Argentina with passengers who matched the description of those on the list, the Brits said nothing. They watched as the people they wanted walked free into Argentina. Pujol's mission was accomplished once the Allied forces had occupied Germany. However, he continued to help Nazis escape for another year. He worked independently and without the permission of any government. Historians don't know exactly why he did this. Perhaps he felt bad about the suffering he inflicted on people during the war. Or perhaps he wanted to atone for his crimes. Pujol definitely had a reason, but he took it to his grave. Another British agent, Major Ralph James, gave testimony that lines up with Pujol's claims. James led a unit of spies in northern Germany. After the war, he uncovered a Nazi document that explained how submarines would be used to rescue Hitler. Himmler and Göring, as well as thousands of Luftwaffe pilots and SS officers, James shared this discovery with his superiors, but no action was taken. His next piece of intelligence was ignored, too. James reported that he heard from locals that 2 planes landed in a forest in northern Germany on May 2, 1945. The passengers disembarked and disappeared. According to the locals, the planes were headed to Argentina. This was the last piece of intelligence that James shared before being sent home. Once back in Britain, he read a newspaper account of the Nuremberg trials. The article claimed that Hitler had taken his own life in the bunker. James reached out to his former commanding officer to tell him that he believed the reports of Hitler's death were false. Unfortunately for James, his superiors didn't want to hear it. The war was over. Hitler was dead. That was all they wanted to hear. Anyone who suggested otherwise was labeled a crackpot. Documents show that the Germans had planned to use U-boats to smuggle Hitler out of the country. And there are reports that Nazis used this method to flee to South America. So why aren't there any records of Hitler's escape? Some say the truth is in the paperwork somewhere, hidden in plain sight among the hundreds of boxes of files. But others say the truth is in the silence, in the lack of paper trail. If Hitler had escaped, the Americans would have been sure to find evidence of it. They sifted through every scrap of intelligence they could get their hands on. Why would they have missed something this big? Let us know what you think. Was Hitler really in the bunker when it fell? Did he take his own life? Or did he escape to South America on a U-boat? Let us know your theories in the comments below. As I was making my way through Patagonia, I heard many stories from locals about Germans arriving in the dead of night, carrying guns and setting up camp. I visited some of the towns that people described to me and discovered eerie sights, like abandoned bunkers from the 1940s, rusting radios used for spying and old weapons caches hidden in the hills. And no one knows exactly why. One of these places is the small town of Comodoro Rivadavia, which sits at the bottom of Argentina's Atlantic coast. I had seen this place before, but only from the air. It's hard to miss the gigantic abandoned oil refinery that dominates the landscape. But I had never really looked into what the town was all about until now. I met up with a local guide who took me around the town, showing me places that most tourists don't see. We started out by visiting an old German Lutheran cemetery, where headstones from the 1930s poked out of the ground. Our next stop was a World War II-era bunker built into the hillside, overlooking the ocean. And if that wasn't weird enough, we then found another one nearby, filled with old German military hardware, including helmets, rifles, and even ammunition still sealed inside their original wooden boxes. Then there were the houses. Many of them were abandoned or empty, having been built just after the war started back in Europe, and so it seemed strange to me that they had never been occupied. Then I came across an old woman walking down the street, and I stopped and asked her if she knew why the Germans had come to this remote part of Argentina. She told me that her grandmother had once worked as a maid for a wealthy German family that had settled here, and she had often heard her grandmother talking about how strange it is that her employers had arrived in the middle of the night and always insisted on paying cash. She also said that her grandmother never saw any of the children of the family, even though she knew that they had them. I didn't know it yet, but this story would become a recurring theme throughout my travels in Patagonia. So I pressed on, moving further south to the city of Rossen. On the way, I passed a few more abandoned settlements that seemed odd, because they appeared to have been built in anticipation of residents who never arrived. In Rossen, I found an old German schoolhouse and was told that the teachers who had run it were brought over from Germany specially to teach the children of the German immigrants. No one ever showed up. The buildings here seem to have been built during the war years, and many are owned by people with distinctly German names, according to public records, but the houses sit abandoned, empty and closed off to anyone passing by. I wanted to learn more about who might have lived here and why they had left. So I went to the local library to dig through the old documents. I eventually came across the original deed to one of the houses I had seen earlier. It was signed by a man named Carl Schutz, who apparently bought the land in the early 1940s. According to the records, he paid for the parcel in full and no liens or mortgage had ever been put against it. The more I learned, the weirder this place seemed. How could so many people have come here, built all of these houses and then just disappeared without a trace? I tried to imagine what it must have been like for the locals who witnessed this mass arrival in the middle of nowhere. If something like this happened today, it would make world news. But in the 1940s, there were no reporters around to cover it, and the event has been lost to history. To make things even stranger, I then discovered that one of the families living here had originally come from the nearby town of Puerto Madryn. I had already visited Puerto Madryn and spent several days wandering around, talking to people and checking out the local historical society, and what I learned was bizarre. Back when the town was founded in 1902, there was a sizable contingent of German settlers among its founders. One of them was a man named Johann Baptist von Moltzen, who served as a councilman and magistrate. He owned a huge ranch in the area and reportedly brought over hundreds of German sheep to start a flock. Another founding member of the town was Paul Königs, who became one of the wealthiest men in town thanks to his sheep and cattle ranches. He too had come directly from Germany, bringing with him his wife and daughter Gerda. And this is where the story takes a very dark turn. See, when World War II broke out in Europe, young Gerda was a teenager living in Puerto Madryn, Argentina. But soon after the war began, she boarded a ship bound for Germany. There, she joined the Nazi Party and eventually married Joseph Mengele, the infamous doctor from Auschwitz who oversaw the killings of more than 3 million people. Together, they had a son and lived in Germany until the end of the war, at which point they fled to South America. But unlike many of the other Nazis who escaped to Argentina, Gerda and her husband were never captured. Decades later, she lives in Brazil under a false identity, while her son lives openly in Germany as a businessman. While researching this video, I came across a number of other stories like this one. For example, I found the grave of a German soldier in the local cemetery, buried in a plot owned by the German consulate. His name was Karl Dittmer, and he died in 1945 at the age of 21. This led me to believe that he may have been one of the crewmen aboard one of the German submarines that had wrecked along the coast. Speaking of which, there have been modern-day documentaries produced that show what appear to be the remains of wrecked submarines lying in the shallow waters just off the coast. But Argentina's official stance is that no such wrecks exist, and so the story has been largely ignored. In fact, there are so many anomalies here that it's hard to know where to start. Here's what we do know. Between 1937 and 1945, the German Navy sent at least 5 submarines to the southern tip of Argentina. Their mission was to rendezvous with cargo ships that would bring them supplies and then set sail back to Germany. But Argentina knew what was going on and refused to let the submarines resupply. So they were forced to turn around and go home, sailing north along the coast. At some point, at least 3 of the submarines wrecked along the coast, killing all hands and sending messages to the surface that they had sunk and needed help. But those messages were never received because Argentina had cut off radio communications with Germany. The survivors on the 3 remaining submarines were eventually picked up by the Royal Navy and taken off the ships. They were supposed to be imprisoned, but somehow managed to escape before being placed in holding cells. The last 2 submarines continued on to their final destinations, but we don't know what happened to them. What we do know is that Argentina had a policy in place that allowed Germans to enter the country without being registered, which made it easy for the submarine crews to slip ashore and disappear. In total, between 1931 and 1945, An estimated 8,000 Germans entered Argentina illegally. That's a big number, considering that Germany's population at the time was about 66 million people. So these 8,000 represented about 1% of Germany's population, a number that's comparable to the population of a large American city. We also know that the Argentine government had a policy of protecting Axis nationals from capture after the war ended. Why they did this isn't entirely clear, but it likely had to do with securing trade routes and obtaining raw materials. Argentina's economy was badly damaged by the Great Depression, and the country needed resources to rebuild. Germany had lots of those resources and was desperate to secure a stable source of food and other necessities for its people. But regardless of why Argentina offered protection, it seems that the country's leaders were not willing to sacrifice their own interests to uphold their agreements with the Allies. Instead, they chose to hide thousands of Germans in secret locations around the country, and then hoped that the world would move on to other things. Unfortunately for them, this didn't happen. Even today, people around the world are fascinated by the idea of Nazis living undetected in Argentina. And that means that journalists and amateur historians keep searching for evidence of their presence here. Since first coming to Argentina in 2012, I've heard countless stories about Nazis living in the country. I've read about everything from secret bunkers hidden beneath lakes to Nazi treasure buried in the desert. I've even heard about UFOs playing a role in helping Nazis escape to Antarctica. Now, none of these stories have been proven true, but that hasn't stopped people from looking. In recent years, the search for hidden Nazis in Argentina has increased. Researchers have combed through property records, looking for homes with German owners. They've scoured old newspapers for passenger lists and immigration records, and they've interviewed people who lived through the war in Argentina. This research has turned up plenty of leads, but nothing concrete. There are lots of houses with German owners, but most of them can be accounted for. There are lots of old newspapers with German immigrants listed as passengers, but most of them also can be accounted for. And as for the people who lived through the war in Argentina, well, they tend to be pretty tight-lipped. Some people have come forward with stories of their families hiding Nazis in their homes, or even employing them as servants, but these stories are often contradictory and impossible to verify. Others say they saw German soldiers roaming the countryside or working on farms, but no one has ever been able to produce a photograph or other physical evidence. Still, others claim to have seen German bunkers or spy equipment, but no such structures have ever been found. So could an entire generation of war criminals have lived and died in secret, hidden in plain sight? Well, it's certainly possible, but the truth is we don't know for sure. What we do know is that there were thousands of Germans living in Argentina by the end of World War II, and many of them came from prominent families with deep ties to the Nazi Party. We also know that the Argentine government did everything it could to protect these people, granting them citizenship, issuing them new passports, and even helping them change their names. Could they have hidden themselves so well that not even the most thorough searchers could find them? Maybe. But one thing's for sure. The mystery of what happened to Germany's lost generation in Argentina is one that will continue to fascinate people for years to come. The ocean around Rio de Janeiro has a lot of history, from Portuguese galleons laden with gold to modern cruise ships carrying thousands of tourists. But there is another kind of ship whose story is almost completely forgotten. The tale of the U-boat is one of conflict and conspiracy. bravery and betrayal, all wrapped up in an adventure so audacious it seems almost unbelievable. By the end of World War II, the Germans had lost over 300 U-boats, and while most were sunk in the Atlantic, a handful ended up resting in relative peace at the bottom of the sea in South America. But how did they get there? And why have they remained such a mystery for over 82 years? For the first 4 years of World War II, the German U-boats operated freely in the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships transporting vital supplies to the British Empire. This period is known as the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was one of the longest continuous military engagements in history. It was also a critical part of the war, because cutting off Britain's access to food and raw materials would be essential if Germany was going to win. And the U-boats had significant success. At one point in 1942, the Germans were sinking over 1 million tons of shipping every month. But this all came crashing down in September of 1943. When the Battle of the North Atlantic turned against them, a new piece of technology called the ASW, or anti-submarine warfare, had been developed by the British. This made finding and destroying U-boats much easier. On top of this, the weather in the North Atlantic worsened. Storms and high winds made it difficult for the submarines to fire their torpedoes accurately, and once the escorts of merchant ships were reinforced with anti-submarine warfare equipment, the U-boats struggled to even get close enough to launch an attack. The result was devastating. In just 6 months, the Germans lost 281 U. With the situation looking so bleak, Hitler ordered his commanders to look for new hunting grounds. Enter South America. In June of 1943, German Admiral Karl Dönitz gave the order for 5 U-boats to head south towards the frigid waters of the southern Atlantic. Their mission was to break into the port of Rio de Janeiro and sink Allied shipping. It was a nearly impossible task. The entrance to the bay was heavily guarded. There were multiple minefields, and any submarine attempting to enter would be detected long before reaching the harbor. But the men aboard those U-boats didn't care. They had nothing left to lose. Over the next 3 months, the crews of U-boat 97, 160, 507, 517, and 163 sank 8 Allied ships, including 2 tankers and several tugboats. But they also paid a heavy price. Only one of the 5 U-boats returned to Germany. The others were sunk by the escorts of the merchant ships they attacked. Still, the operation was considered a success. The fact that they were able to penetrate one of the most secure harbors in the world was a propaganda coup for the Germans. It showed that no place was safe, and even the seemingly invincible Allied shipping could be destroyed. But there was a problem. 2 of the U-boats that had entered the bay never came back out. U-97 and U-517 both ran aground after being damaged in combat, and they had nowhere to go. The Germans knew that their presence had been detected, and so they scuttled the boats, hoping that they would never be found. One of these, U-97, still sits in the mud at the edge of the bay near Rio. The other, U-517, is believed to have been broken up for scrap metal, although some accounts say that it was towed out to sea and sunk. In the official German records, these 2 boats are listed as missing, which led to rumors that they had actually managed to escape the harbor undetected. These stories only became more widespread when the American author Clive Cussler wrote a book called Raise, the U-Boat, in 1978. The novel tells the story of an American treasure hunter who discovers one of the sunken U-boats in the bay. He teams up with a German submarine commander who escaped in one of the U-boats, and together they raise it to the surface. While fictional, the story tapped into existing rumors and conspiracy theories surrounding the German U-boats in Rio, and as a result, it helped to keep the legend alive. And legends tend to grow over time. Some people began to claim that the U-boats hadn't come to Rio to attack shipping, but to surrender to the Brazilian authorities. Others said that the Germans had hidden a fortune in gold aboard the submarines, and that it was still waiting to be found. The reality was much more mundane. The Germans had simply run out of options. There was nowhere else for them to go. The closest friendly port was over 5,000 miles away in Bordeaux, and by the time they got there, the war would be over, so they might as well surrender to the Allies. But the myth-making didn't stop. In the years since the war, several articles have been written claiming that the Germans had used the cover of the night to sneak into the bay. They allegedly hid during the day in a small cove called the Gruta de Lords, where they waited for darkness to fall before launching their attacks, but there is no evidence to support this claim. The only reason the U-boats didn't immediately attack when they arrived in the bay was because they had to repair damage sustained in transit. And the fact that they used a cave to hide is nothing more than wishful thinking on the part of the storytellers. In reality, these U-boats were a flotilla of desperate men. They had been fighting for over 3 years and were exhausted. They had lost hundreds of comrades and were running out of hope. All they wanted was to see the war through to its end. That's why, when the armistice was finally signed in May 1945, they surrendered to the Brazilians without a fight. Today, only one of the 5 U-boats remains visible, the rest having been scrapped for their useful materials. But that one, U-97, is still there, buried in the mud near the entrance to the bay. For decades, attempts to recover the wreck were made, but each time the German government intervened and blocked the project. They didn't want their citizens to know the truth behind their country's last U-boat mission. It wasn't until 2006 that the Brazilian Navy finally located and identified the wreck. Even then, it took another 9 years before they were able to lift it from the mud and bring it to the surface. When the U-boat was finally raised, it was greeted by a crowd of onlookers, many of whom had heard the stories about the German treasure, but there was no gold to be found. What they did find was something even more valuable: the truth. Inside the submarine, the Brazilians discovered personal belongings of the crew, things like letters from home and photographs of their families. These items told the real story of what had happened to these men, not the myth that had grown up around them. It was a story of courage and sacrifice, of duty and despair, and it was a story that needed to be told. As Brazil prepared to turn over the wreck to Germany, they invited the families of the crew to come and see the submarine for themselves. Many of them flew from all over the world to attend the ceremony. It was an emotional reunion, one that brought closure to a chapter of history that had remained hidden for too long. In the end, the story of the Nazi U-boats in South America isn't really about war or treasure. It is about how history hides in plain sight and how sometimes it takes a long time to uncover the truth. It's about the blurred line between myth and reality, and how nations rewrite the past to suit their needs. As more archives open and more wrecks are discovered, we may one day get closer to the full story. But until then, the ocean keeps its secrets and history waits for those willing to dive deeper.